Rowan Mercer thought she was buying a rotted-out farm shed for parts and maybe a little solitude. For $700, it was worth the gamble until she noticed a strange metal edge buried in the dirt. Beneath that shed, hidden for decades, was a World War II-era bunker, fully intact, humming with forgotten history. What she uncovered next wasn't just steel and stories. It was a love lost, a legacy buried, and a call to finish what someone never got to say. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this remind you how history still breathes beneath our feet, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode may just rewrite the past. Rowan Mercer had never been much for sentiment. Wrenches made more sense than words, and engines never lied. So when she handed over $700 in cash for a rusting farm shed on the edge of Winfield County, she didn't expect anything more than spare parts and a quiet place to think. The listing hadn't even included photos, just as is, scrawled in block print and a warning that the structure leaned a little in the wind. That suited her just fine. The shed sat on a sloping patch of farmland, surrounded by fields that hadn't seen a harvest since the 82nds. Grass grew wild through old tractor ruts, and a single rusted truck bed rested beside the building like a forgotten relic. Rowan stepped out of her pickup, boots crunching on gravel, and stared at the corrugated tin structure. The siding was flaking, roof sagging, doors half-hinged, but it stood. That was enough. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. Cobwebs swayed in the beams of her flashlight, and piles of broken crates lined the corners. Tools from another era littered a bent workbench, and everything smelled of engine oil and old paper. Rowan exhaled, slow and satisfied. "Home enough," she muttered, her voice lost in the stillness. But something was off. As she moved deeper into the shed, her boots thudded solid on packed dirt until they didn't. Near the back, the ground felt hollow. She stopped, knelt, pressed her hand to the soil. It was warmer here, and in the silence, there was a sound, a faint, rhythmic hum, too mechanical to be wind. Her brow furrowed. With a small crowbar from her truck, she began scraping at the floor. The soil gave way too easily. Within minutes, she uncovered the edge of something flat and metal. It wasn't part of the shed. It was hidden, on purpose. A few more inches revealed rivets and rusted hinges like a door, a heavy one. Rowan sat back on her heels, brushing sweat and grit from her forehead. The sun was dipping behind the fields now, casting gold across the bent tin walls. She looked at the hatch again. Not just a trapdoor. This thing had weight. History. She wasn't sure why, but her pulse had quickened, like standing on the edge of something vast. She rose, walked to her truck, and grabbed a flashlight. Then she came back and stared at the door. "What the hell are you?" she whispered. She didn't know it yet. But beneath her feet was more than steel and shadow. Beneath her feet was a story sealed in silence, waiting to be heard. The next morning, Rowan returned with gloves, a crowbar, a 5-pound sledgehammer, and a fresh thermos of black coffee. The air was sharp, the way it gets after an unexpected October chill. Dew clung to the edges of the rusted shed like it, too, was holding its breath. She stood at the edge of the excavation, flashlight clipped to her belt, and stared again at the metal hatch she'd half uncovered the night before. The thing wasn't small. 3 feet wide, maybe 5 across. The color was somewhere between gunmetal and neglect. Blue-gray, faded by time, streaked with orange rust. A massive handle protruded from the center, flanked by 2 iron latches that had fused with corrosion. She crouched down and brushed more dirt from the edges. Weld seams. Industrial bolts. Not homemade. This had been built to last. She swung the sledge once against the handle, not hard, just enough to hear the metallic clink echo back from beneath. The sound was strange, deep, hollow, not quite empty, like it led somewhere. She tried the handle. It didn't budge. The hinges groaned when she tapped them, locked from inside, sealed shut by time. She wasn't sure, but she'd opened worse. She worked for an hour, gently tapping, scraping, chiseling out the dirt from around the perimeter. Occasionally she stopped to sip coffee or stare out over the still field, wondering what the hell she was doing. It had started as a fixer-upper, a cheap distraction from a messy year. She didn't want to get involved with mysteries or lost history. But the door wouldn't leave her alone. By midday, she'd cleared the hinges and freed the bolts. She wedged the crowbar into the seam, braced her feet, and leaned into it. Nothing. Then she shifted, grunted, and threw her shoulder into the effort. Something gave. A loud creak screamed from the ground. The hatch shifted, an inch maybe, just enough to let out a breath of stale, warm air. Rowan froze. The smell was metallic. Old oil and paper and something faintly electrical. Her flashlight beam danced down into the dark space below through a narrow crack. She saw concrete, stairs. And then, with one more heave, the door groaned open wide enough for a person to slip through. She hesitated. Logic told her to go slow, maybe call someone, maybe set up backup. But instinct overruled. She descended. The stairs were steep and narrow. Metal slats bolted into the dirt and concrete walls. They creaked under her weight, but held. Her flashlight flicked against decades of dust and cobwebs. And then, at the bottom, she stopped. Because the air wasn't still. A single light bulb, small and yellowed, was glowing faintly above a steel generator still running. Somehow, somewhere, a power source had endured. The generator was old, World War II era by the looks of it, with thick cables snaking into the walls. Beside it sat a metal desk, a rotary phone, and a battered army cot with a folded wool blanket still resting on top. The floor was clean, swept even. Rowan turned in a slow circle. The bunker was real, not just a cellar or a trap room. This had been someone's shelter, someone's last-ditch plan for survival. It was intact, undisturbed, and she had just cracked it open for the first time in decades. Rowan stepped fully into the bunker, careful not to disturb anything. The air felt thicker down here, warmer too. Not stale exactly, but old, like time had settled in the corners. Her flashlight swept slowly across the room. Every surface was covered in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed, except for the generator, still faintly humming like it had been waiting. She knelt beside it, touching the metal casing. Warm. She followed the cords to a fuse box tucked into the wall, ancient, but upgraded. At some point, someone had rewired this place. Not recently, but definitely after the war. The walls were reinforced concrete, lined with metal shelving. On the shelves, field radios, metal canisters, stacked boxes labeled "Emergency Rations" in faded stencils. She opened one. Inside, vacuum-sealed tins, water packets, even cigarettes in a crumbling wax sleeve. Everything still intact, untouched. In the corner stood a tall locker, army green with peeling paint. She swung it open. Inside, a jacket, U.S. Army, 1944. Name stitched above the heart in white thread, Lieutenant Vernon Hayes. The name hit her like a whisper. On the adjacent wall, framed photographs hung crookedly, black and white images of soldiers in uniform. A woman in a soft floral dress holding a book. A young man standing beside what looked like a portable radio tower. All worn, water-stained, but whole. Rowan stepped closer, studying each one. Someone had lived here, not just sheltered lived. There was a rhythm to the place, the cot neatly made. A folded towel, even a row of books lined carefully on a shelf. Engineering manuals, Morse code reference guides, a leather-bound journal. She reached for the journal, opened the first page. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was precise, almost architectural. January 12th, 1945. No transmission again today. I fear the frequencies are dead. But I will keep trying. I promised Evie I would return. If I can't, Then this bunker will carry what I couldn't. Rowan sat down slowly in the metal chair near the desk. The floor beneath it creaked gently, and her boot hit something solid. She crouched, brushing her hand along the edge of the floor. A small panel, wooden, fitted imperfectly into the concrete. She pulled it open. Inside, a metal box, square and dented, like an old lunch tin. It was locked. Her heart began to pound. This wasn't just a place where someone hid during the war. It was a place where someone waited, where a man named Vernon had carved out space for his thoughts, for hope, for whoever might come next. Someone had loved this bunker enough to wire it for power long after the world moved on. Someone had fought the silence with routine, with order. She looked around the space again and tried to imagine what it must have felt like: the nights, the loneliness, the endless transmission attempts, the longing, the fear. And now, decades later, it had surfaced again through her. She stood and ran her hand along the edge of the cot. The wool blanket was worn, but folded sharp, a habit of discipline. Or devotion. She didn't know it yet, but the locked box held more than letters. It held the final words of a soldier who vanished without a trace, and soon, those words would pull her deeper into a story no history book had ever told. Rowan spent the rest of the afternoon studying the bunker in silence, tracing the shape of its story through fingerprints left on steel. It was as if time had paused the day Vernon Hayes last stood here, everything waiting for a return that never came. She sat on the edge of the cot, flashlight beam flickering across the metal box she'd found hidden beneath the floor. The lock was simple old brass, the kind that had given up its fight with rust decades ago. She wedged her screwdriver beneath the clasp, gave it a twist, and the lid popped open with a reluctant sigh. Inside were bundles of paper tied together with a strip of faded cloth. Letters, dozens of them, some still sealed, others opened and gently refolded. Beneath them, a stack of small photographs, grainy, square, the kind printed from old negatives. Rowan held one up. A man in uniform, sleeves rolled high, sitting on the hood of a jeep. He was grinning. The name stitched on his jacket matched the one she'd seen earlier. Lieutenant Vernon Hayes. Beside him stood a young woman with soft hair pulled back in curls, sunlight spilling over her shoulder. The back of the photo read, Evie, summer of 43. Rowan exhaled. Whoever Evie was, she had meant everything to him. She pulled one of the letters free, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The ink had bled in places, but the words were legible. Evie, the days are long down here. The hum of the generator is the only heartbeat I trust anymore. They said the relay would be temporary, but I've lost track of weeks. I built this place to survive, but I built these words for you. If you're reading this, it means I never made it home. I hope someone kind found this, someone who knows that love can echo, even in the dark. The words stopped there, midline, as if interrupted by something sudden. Rowan swallowed, her throat tight. She looked back into the box and saw more bundles, each marked with a date, 1,944, 1,945, and then nothing. Just silence. The last letter was unsealed. It was shorter than the rest, a few lines scrawled in haste. Evie, if anyone finds these, know that the mission wasn't finished. The coordinates I left behind, they'll explain everything. Tell them what we built here wasn't meant for war. It was meant for hope. Rowan turned the page over. On the back, written faintly in pencil, were a series of numbers and letters: 45 degrees, 16N, 93 degrees, 3W, followed by one last word. Promise. She leaned back, staring at the bunker's low ceiling, the faint hum of the ancient generator filling the silence like breath. What could coordinates like that have meant to a man hiding beneath a farm in the middle of nowhere? And why did it sound less like a code and more like a confession? Her flashlight beam passed across the wall again, landing on a small, rectangular shadow, a panel slightly offset from the others. She pressed against it, and it shifted inward with a soft click. Dust fell like ash, as the section of wall swung open to reveal a hidden compartment behind it. Inside was another tin, smaller, blackened, with edges worn smooth. It wasn't locked this time. Rowan lifted the lid, half expecting more letters. Instead, she found a small reel of magnetic tape, its surface brittle with age, and a note scrawled on the inside of the lid. Final transmission, only if Evie returns. Rowan's pulse quickened. She didn't know who Evie was, or if she was even still alive, but something told her that message wasn't meant to stay buried. She closed the tin, holding it tight against her chest. Above her, through layers of dirt and decades of silence, sunlight was fading from the world, and for the first time, she felt the bunker watching her back. By the time Rowan stepped out into the cooling dusk, the fields had turned a deep amber. The shed behind her looked smaller now, like a lid to something sacred. She locked the doors, placed the key in her back pocket, and sat on the tailgate of her truck, the metal box resting on her knees. The reel inside it felt heavier than anything she'd pulled from the earth before, not in weight, but in meaning. This wasn't a discovery, it was a responsibility. She spent that night researching. At her kitchen table, laptop open and hands still stained from bunker dust, she typed the name Vernon Hayes into every military archive and search engine she could find. There were a few hits, mostly mentions of a communications officer stationed stateside during the final years of the war. One photo popped up, grainy but familiar, the same man from the Polaroids. A caption read, Lieutenant Vernon C. Hayes, 1944, missing in action. No other record, no memorial, no follow-up. She searched the coordinates next. 45 degrees, 16 N, 93 degrees, 3W. It led her to a location outside Minneapolis, a warehouse district near the edge of the old rail lines. Current records said the land was condemned, abandoned, but during the 1,940 seconds, it had been home to a military logistics hub, communications central. And then it clicked. Vernon hadn't just built the bunker as a shelter. He had built it as a relay, a secret node meant to pass transmissions if the war ever reached American soil, a place to keep communication alive, a backup heartbeat in the darkest hour. Rowan leaned back in her chair, the realization settling deep. But the final transmission, how could she play it? Most of that technology was extinct. She reached out to the local radio museum on a whim, attaching photos of the tape and the box, explaining she'd uncovered it in a historical context. She left out the exact location and specifics. She wasn't ready to share that part. Not yet. By the following morning, she had a reply. A technician named Ed Gaines wrote back with an offer. If she brought the tape in, they could attempt a safe transfer to digital. No guarantees. The tape was fragile. It might not survive. She made the drive that afternoon. Ed was a man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of steady hands born from years of working with antique audio. He handled the reel like a newborn, adjusting the tension with soft fingers and murmured instructions to a machine older than she was. Rowan sat in a worn chair by the wall, watching him thread the tape through the reader. Then a click. A low hiss, static, and then a voice. It crackled at first, tinny and thin, but undeniably human. A man speaking softly, measured. Vernon, to whomever finds this, if it is Evie, I hope with everything in me that you found peace. If it is someone else, then you must carry this forward. This bunker was never about hiding. It was about remembering, about love, about never letting silence win. Rowan felt her eyes burn. They told me not to send it, that the war was ending, but I couldn't leave without saying goodbye. A pause, a breath. Evie, I'm sorry. I wasn't brave enough to write it on paper, but I loved you. I loved you more than the cause, more than the uniform, more than the fear that kept me underground. If you're hearing this, it means time has finally let go. The tape ended in static. No signature. Just a kind of stillness that felt louder than any explosion. Ed turned off the machine and sat back quietly. That, he said, was a man who thought the world forgot him. Rowan didn't speak. She just held the tin to her chest and nodded. But someone hadn't forgotten. Somewhere out there, Evie might still exist. And Rowan suddenly knew this wasn't where the story ended. It was where it finally began to matter. Rowan didn't sleep much that night. She lay in bed, the glow of the digital copy of Vernon's voice still lingering in her headphones, echoing through her thoughts like a ghost gently knocking on the door of memory. She couldn't stop thinking about Evie where she was now, if she was still alive. And if so, did she know Vernon's final words had waited this long for her? The next day, Rowan drove back out to the shed. The sun was bright, but it didn't touch the weight that now clung to the earth around the bunker. It was different now, no longer just a place. It was a threshold, a place where silence had been preserved for a reason. She unlocked the door, moved aside the makeshift coverings, and descended once more into the waiting dark. The generator was still humming. She let it stay that way. The rhythm had become something like a heartbeat. This time, she brought tools, not to dismantle, but to restore. Brushes, gloves, archival sleeves, and soft cloths. She didn't want to take anything out. She wanted to keep it whole, intact, honest. Piece by piece, she dusted the radios, labeled the boxes, cataloged each letter and photo. She worked for hours, sometimes whispering under her breath like the bunker could hear her, like Vernon could. She needed answers. That evening, she drove into town and visited the local archives. Winfield's town hall was mostly digital now, but tucked in the back corner of the Historical Society was a dusty room full of microfilm, census records, and yellowing phone books from the 1,940 seconds. She traced Evie's name from one photograph, Evelyn Connors. If the faded corner note was correct, and combed through every local listing, newspaper, and family registry she could find. Finally, she struck gold. A 1,947 article titled, "Letters Left Unsent. Local Woman Mourns Missing Fiancé." The photo was blurry, but unmistakable. It was Evie, just a little older. The story said she had never married, that she waited 3 years after Vernon was declared MIA, before finally leaving Winfield. The last known address was a small town 4 hours north, near the lakes. Rowan sat back in the stiff wooden chair and let the air leave her lungs slowly. She didn't know if Evelyn Connors was still alive, but something told her she might be. And if she was, then Vernon's voice, those last words, had waited long enough. She made the drive 2 days later. The town was quiet, hemmed in by pine trees and foggy water lines. A post office worker pointed her toward a modest house on the edge of a gravel road, faded shutters and all. Rowan parked out front, nerves sparking like loose wires. She knocked once. The door creaked open after a long pause, and there she was, a woman in her 90s, silver hair pinned back neatly, eyes sharp despite the passage of decades. She looked at Rowan like she already knew. "Evelyn Connors?" Rowan asked softly. The woman nodded. "I think I found something that belongs to you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Evie stepped aside, holding the door open. Rowan entered, heart pounding, tin in her hands, and history in her throat. Evie led Rowan to the sitting room like someone walking through memory, not space. The home was modest, untouched by modern design trends. Doilies softened the edges of aging furniture, and framed photographs lined the walls like quiet witnesses. Rowan took a seat on the floral couch, while Evie settled into a high-backed chair across from her, hands resting on a worn book in her lap. She hadn't said a word since opening the door. Rowan placed the tin box on the coffee table and slid it gently across. "It was buried," she said softly. "Under a shed on an abandoned farm. The generator's still running. It's all still there." Evie's fingers trembled as she reached forward. She didn't open the box yet. Instead, she stared at it the way one stares at a sealed letter from a person you'd thought was lost to time. "He built it," she whispered. "He told me once, if the worst ever comes, I'll hide my hope in steel." I didn't know what he meant. I thought it was poetry. Rowan said nothing. There were no right words here. Evie finally lifted the lid. The letters inside, yellowed but preserved, seemed to catch her breath mid-air. She reached for one, recognized the fold, the ink, the way Vernon's cursive leaned to the right. He always wrote like he was in a hurry, she murmured, even when he had all the time in the world. She opened the letter, the first he'd written from the bunker. Her lips moved silently as she read. Her eyes, old but clear, shimmered as the words reached her. He wasn't just hiding, she said eventually. He was still fighting, in his own way. Rowan nodded. He made a final transmission. I had it digitized. You can hear his voice. Evie looked up, stunned. His voice? Rowan pulled out her phone and hit play. Static hummed at first. Then Vernon's voice came through steady, intimate, real. Evie's hand covered her mouth as the years fell away. By the end of the message, she was crying, quietly. The kind of tears that don't need sobs, just release. When the recording ended, the silence between them was full of reverence. I waited, Evie said at last. For years. After they declared him missing, I still waited. Everyone told me to move on, but I always felt like he was somewhere unfinished. Rowan swallowed. You were right. Evie touched the letters again, each one a piece of a man frozen in time. He didn't build that bunker to survive, she said. He built it to be found. Later, Rowan offered to take her there. Not for curiosity, but for closure. Evie hesitated only a moment before agreeing. That evening, they arrived just before sunset. Rowan helped her down the stairs, hand on her back, flashlight guiding each step. The generator still hummed. The cot still sat waiting. Evie stood in the center of it all, turning slowly, tears falling freely now. She ran her fingers across the desk, the photos, the framed note Vernon had left inside the wall. She placed one hand on the radio console. I always wondered why I couldn't let go, she said. Maybe this was why. I was supposed to hear him one more time. She sat on the cot for a while after that, Rowan beside her, neither saying anything, just listening to the echo of love sealed in steel, preserved not by accident but by devotion. Word spreads in small towns like roots under soil, quiet, invisible, but fast. By the time Rowan returned from the bunker with Evie, neighbors had started to notice the comings and goings at the old farm lot. A rusted shed, long ignored, suddenly looked like the center of something. But Rowan kept the door locked, the hatch sealed unless she was inside. This wasn't a museum. It was a grave of sorts. And more than that, it was a promise kept. 3 days after their visit, Rowan was back at the bunker, this time cataloging photos and scanning documents for preservation. She worked with slow hands, reverent, careful not to bend or bruise the past. She'd begun placing archival labels on the walls. Radio Array Module. Generator Unit. Original. LTV. Hayes's Journal. She didn't want to disturb the bunker's essence, but she wanted its truth preserved. Then, just after noon, her phone buzzed. It was Evie. I think someone else needs to see it, she said. He's waited long enough. Rowan didn't ask who. She simply said, come by tomorrow. The next day, a black sedan pulled up just before noon. Out stepped a tall man in his late 60s, blazer too stiff for the dust roads, but eyes that had seen both war and love. Evie followed behind him slowly, cane tapping against gravel. Rowan, this is Martin Hayes, she said, Vernon's nephew. He was just a baby when Vernon disappeared, but he's been searching for his uncle ever since. Rowan shook his hand. It was warm, firm, but trembled slightly at the edges. You found him, Martin said quietly. Not his body, but everything else. They descended into the bunker together. Martin paused at every step, eyes wide, lips pursed in awe. When he reached the bottom and took in the room, he exhaled, like someone breathing again after years underwater. This is intact, he said, stunned. Every damn inch. Evie smiled softly. He was always meticulous. Martin ran his hand along the edge of the desk, then the cot, then the framed transmission letter on the wall. He sat down without asking, elbows on knees, head bowed. He always said if anything ever happened, he wanted to be remembered as a builder, not a fighter, he murmured. But the family never had proof, no remains, no closure, just paperwork and silence. Rowan watched the weight settle on his shoulders. Grief decades late still looked fresh when spoken aloud. "I have the full archive digitized," she said gently. "Photos, letters, voice recording. You can have it all." He looked up, eyes damp. "Heard the voice already. Evie played it for me last night. Thought I'd be okay, but hearing him say her name, his voice broke." Evie sat beside him, hand on his back. "You were just a baby," she said, "but you never stopped looking. You gave him a second life." Rowan stepped aside, letting them sit in silence. That afternoon, she gave Martin a flash drive, sealed in a small wooden box. "This is yours," she said. "Do what you think is right." He nodded, holding it, like something sacred. As they left the bunker, Martin paused at the hatch and looked back. "This place, it's not just history, it's legacy." Rowan smiled. "That's exactly what it is." And as the hatch closed behind them, the silence inside the earth was no longer hollow. It was full of names, voices, and the kind of love that time cannot erase. The idea wasn't hers. Not exactly. It came from Evie, who called one morning with a voice lighter than Rowan had ever heard it. "I think it should be heard again," she said. "Not just by me, by everyone who never got their goodbye." Rowan knew exactly what she meant. That week, she reached out to the local historical society and a nearby veterans museum. Both were immediately intrigued. Within days, a plan took shape. A small public event at the town hall, a presentation of the discovery, and at its heart, the broadcast Vernon's final message, played out loud for the first time since it was sealed away. The event was held on a mild Saturday afternoon. Folding chairs lined the hall, the front row reserved for Evie and Martin. Rowan arrived early, box of documents in hand, the flash drive safely tucked into her jacket. A display table stood near the entrance, filled with photos from the bunker, a few artifacts, and an old silent radio console she'd gently restored. The cot remained in the bunker, untouched, but everything else came to life under soft lighting and reverent eyes. By 3 p.m., the room was full. Neighbors, veterans, curious locals. A few history buffs who'd driven in from the city after hearing rumors of a buried World War II bunker found under a farm shed. Rowan stood at the podium, hands sweating slightly. Public speaking had never been her thing, but this wasn't about her. It was about a man whose words had waited 80 years to be heard. She cleared her throat. "I'm not a historian," she began, "and I'm definitely not a public speaker. I fix things for a living. Engines, carburetors, steel frames. But this was something different. This was a life someone left behind. Not because they wanted to, but because the world forgot to come back for them." She paused, scanning the room. All eyes on her. Lieutenant Vernon Hayes was declared missing in action in 1945. But he wasn't lost. He was right here, beneath our feet, waiting for someone to finish what he couldn't. And I didn't do it alone. She nodded toward Evie, who smiled through quiet tears, and Martin, who gripped the arms of his chair like they were holding him together. "Today, I want to play his final message, the one he recorded inside the bunker. Never sent, never heard, until now." She pressed play. The speakers filled with soft static. Then Vernon's voice emerged, clearer now than it had any right to be. Strong, gentle, weighted with meaning. "To whomever finds this, if it is Evie, I hope with everything in me that you found peace. If it is someone else, then you must carry this forward. This bunker was never about hiding. It was about remembering, about love, about never letting silence win." The room was still. Not a cough, not a shuffle. Just breath held tight, They told me not to send it, that the war was ending, but I couldn't leave without saying goodbye. Evie, I'm sorry. I wasn't brave enough to write it on paper, but I loved you. More than the cause, more than the uniform, more than the fear that kept me underground. If you're hearing this, it means time has finally let go. The message ended with static, and then the silence. But this time, it didn't feel like absence. It felt like completion. Rowan looked up and saw people wiping eyes. Evie held a handkerchief against her mouth, eyes full, but steady. Martin's gaze was fixed forward, his jaw tight with pride. And then the applause came. Not wild or explosive, but rising like something sacred. As if, somehow, they all understood that this wasn't just a message from the past. It was a reminder that some goodbyes are still waiting to be heard. A week after the broadcast, Rowan returned to the bunker alone. The autumn wind had turned colder, and the fields were beginning to brown, the last wildflowers bowing under the weight of the season's end. She unlocked the shed with hands she now realized were steadier than before. Not because the work was done, but because she finally understood what it meant. She descended the stairs into the earth with practiced ease. The smell of dust, oil, and time met her like an old friend. The generator still hummed softly, steady as breath, though she'd checked the fuel lines the day before and knew it wouldn't last much longer. She'd decided she wouldn't refill it. Some things, after all, deserved rest. She moved through the bunker, eyes tracing every surface, every shelf, every ghost she now knew by name. The photos were still in their places. The letters had been scanned, sleeved, and stored safely preserved not just digitally, but physically, for the museum that would soon house them. But here, in the quiet, they lived differently. They belonged here. She approached the cot, the folded wool blanket still exactly as it had been, and sat for a moment. Her hand brushed the edge of the mattress. She thought of Vernon lying here, eyes open to the ceiling, dreaming of a voice he might never hear again. She thought of Evie, standing just feet from where she sat, decades later, finding the words that were meant for her. Rowan pulled from her jacket pocket a small metal plate she'd engraved the night before. Simple. Just 5 words. Lieutenant Vernon C. Hayes, 1919, 1945. He waited with hope. She screwed it gently into the wooden wall beside the desk, below the photograph of Vernon and Evie, arms entwined in grainy sunshine. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at it for a long time. Then, without ceremony, she turned off the generator for the last time. The bunker sighed into silence. A stillness not of abandonment, but of peace. Above ground, the museum was finalizing plans to reconstruct parts of the site off location. Rowan had donated the recordings, the journal scans, the documents. But she'd made one thing clear. The actual bunker, the space, the soil, the untouched reality of it would remain closed, untouched, sacred. Evie had agreed. Some places don't need tourists, she'd said. They need reverence. That winter, Evie passed quietly in her sleep. Martin called Rowan first. She heard what she needed, he said, and she left, knowing she hadn't been forgotten. Rowan drove out to the shed the day she heard. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just sat on the tailgate of her truck again, as she had the first day, and looked out over the land. The same field, the same wind. But everything had changed. Not because of what she found, but because of what she chose to listen to. Sometimes, restoration doesn't mean putting something back the way it was. Sometimes, it means lifting the silence, carrying the weight, giving a voice to what time tried to bury. As the last of the snow began to fall, Rowan stood, brushed her hands on her jeans, and looked toward the shed one final time. Not a workshop, not a shelter, a message in the earth. And she had answered it.